Hey guys, what's going on? Andrew coming at you, and in this one I'm going to talk about how I see guns in America after living in Sweden for 6 years. I don't identify with one single political party. I'm conservative about some things and I'm liberal about others. My perspective has changed and shifted just from living in a country where it's a little bit harder to get guns, so I just want to share my thoughts with you. And some of these thoughts are going to be deep, but I'm not going to hold anything back here. I'm just going to be 100 with you guys and be honest. So I grew up in Pennsylvania in an area where it was quite common to go hunting. I went hunting in my life, and I had used firearms, and I was shown how to use firearms respectfully. I did some hunting. I had a shotgun growing up, and always thought it was fun to go out and shoot guns and have a good time with that. So that's where it started for me as far as access to guns or having guns. I also thought about how guns directly impacted someone that I know's life, and so there was four major instances that happened in my life that I can remember. When I was a freshman in high school, one of my classmates committed suicide with a rifle, and I was actually at the house next door playing when it happened. I remember seeing the ambulances and everything there. That was in ninth grade. He took a rifle and killed himself. He found a rifle. When I was a little bit older, my grandparents' next door neighbor's husband found out that his wife was going to leave him, and apparently he snapped and he decided to kill his wife and daughter and then himself. So that happened a few years later. When I was in high school, I had a neighbor who lived in my area who went off to Iraq to serve America, to serve the country, bravely of course, and when she got back, she decided to go to the gym to work out, and unfortunately a mass shooting took place there, and she luckily survived, but many women were targeted there. It was a spinning class, and many women were killed. It was a mass shooting in the area. And then finally I've had a family member that has been murdered with a gun. So those are four instances that had happened, and I don't know if that's normal compared to other Americans or not. But those are the instances that directly impacted that I had a connection with in life. And when I came to Sweden and saw that it was much harder to get guns, you can still have guns in Sweden, but it was much harder. I still remember that then Sandy Hook happened, and that was a very shocking one to take. Living outside the country has taught me that gun violence at the extent that we have in the United States, it's not normal. It doesn't happen everywhere. But growing up, I still remember Columbine because I'm a millennial and that's when it started, Columbine. And it just kept happening one after another, and it just kind of became something that we, I think as Americans, accepted that this is going to happen. We have guns in America. This is how it works. It wasn't until living in a society where I was outside of it that I could really take a look at America and think about it and say, this isn't normal, and this is kind of one of those things where the rest of the world kind of looks at America and tries to figure out what's going on. I don't want to necessarily take away someone's right to protect themselves. I don't think that there's an easy button we can push or fix in America to suddenly take all the guns away, and every time we get a little bit close to any kind of, you hear the term common sense gun law, there's so much fighting on both sides. The NRA and other types of fire manufacturing companies are quite powerful in the United States, and they have a lot of political power, and I kind of feel like most Americans can look at the issues going on in America, especially recently, and say to themselves, it's a little bit crazy that one person can cause so much damage as we saw in Las Vegas, or that a student can get a hold of a weapon and cause a lot of damage. So, I was just even looking at numbers about this issue as well. So being outside of the country has taught me all these things. But when we talk about gun victims in America in 2017, I'll give you two numbers because this is usually the argument people give. Victims of gun violence is 38,658. in the United States. If you cut out suicide in the United States, it's 15,549 that lives were taken with a gun. Now, I look at that number and I think two things, which is even if the suicide rate with guns is higher, how many people was alcohol involved and they made a poor decision and they had a gun there and it just made the decision like easier for them. Like it was easy to not think and do it because it's an instant and you're pulling the trigger. It's just one thought that I have when it comes to this. With gun injuries alone, it was 73,505 people were injured by a firearm in the United States. And how it's changed my perspective is I look at this kind of like, okay, that's what the toll is going to be if we have guns. So I look into, let's talk about automobile accidents in the United States, cars. We accept the fact that cars make our lives better. We're able to drive to and from work. We're able to experience more in the world. And there are 37,461 deaths in car accidents. So almost, if you include suicide in the number of guns, you're talking almost the same amount of people die every year by a gun or in a car accident. So then I start to think like this. Do guns in America positively impact our lives in the same way that cars do? I'm not so sure. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't expect to take everybody's guns away tomorrow or the next day, and that's not necessarily what I'm trying to say here. But the thing that frustrates me in this issue as an outsider is I see America when it comes to guns kind of like a friend you have that's an alcoholic. You're not going to be able to, you can't help your friend who's an alcoholic until he admits that he has a drinking problem. We're not going to be able to fix the problem in America until we can admit that we have a gun problem in America. And to blindly do nothing, in my opinion, it doesn't make sense. We could try something. It might not work. But we have to ask ourselves a question. Is the right to bear arms? Because this is the deep fundamental question I struggle with myself when I think about it from someone that has used firearms before. I know it's in our Constitution and everything else, and I understand people are very passionate about it. But is the right to bear firearms worth the collateral damage, the lives, the shootings, the mass shootings, the school shootings we have? Well, at what point do we say, well, like we do with cars, okay, 38,658 people die every year in cars, but you know what? They make our lives better. We're willing to save the risk. Are we saying the same thing about gun violence? What's the acceptable number of mass shootings that we will accept? And it's when I see people argue things, I wish we could talk in that kind of a way. What's the acceptable amount? Obviously, the answer should probably be none. But if we're going to have the right to hold firearms and we're going to keep this law exactly the same and do nothing, we're going to have to accept the consequences with that. And one thing I always wondered that I don't hear people talk about is when cops are shooting people, and there's been lots of instances with that, and I'm not anti-cop or anything like that. I think it's a very difficult job. But I also think, how many times did a cop shoot somebody and when they shouldn't have, but also everybody in the United States could potentially have a firearm as well? So that's an interesting thing you have to think about. And there's so many arguments and things you'll hear, like maybe, these things happen in gun-free zones, there should be guns there. But I also find it interesting that, politicians there's no guns in D.C., they don't want it around, there's no guns in New York City. And look, the counter-argument can be, I want to be fair, is that in Chicago they have the strictest gun laws in the United States, and they also have the worst gun crime. But I'm not sure that means that we should do nothing. I think that we can do something. And yeah, there could be mental health and all these other issues, but again, it's the elephant in the room is the guns. I mean, it doesn't happen anywhere else, and that's what living in Sweden has taught me. And look, the other counter argument people are going to say here, because I already see comments coming in, is that Sweden has an increase in gun violence in Gothenburg, but if you look at the numbers compared to the U.S., I mean, it's insanely low. It happens, and when it happens here, it's a big deal. I think since I've been living in my city in Sweden, maybe there has been a shooting once or twice in 6 years, and it was a massive news story. It's not something that happens every single day. Where, as opposed to when it happens in the United States, you see it, and then you don't even have time to forget about it because the very next day there's a shooting sometimes. There's other things we got to do, of course. We shouldn't be putting people's faces in the news that are involved in these. We should not be mentioning their names. I think that's an important step because I do think there's a link to that. But ultimately, we have to think about, is this right worth it? Is it not worth it to try to change some things? And the last counter argument I'll say is I know that we had a shooting in Paris and that was a massive thing, but again, a very isolated incident. I'm not saying you don't have to have the right to protect yourself. That's not what I'm saying. But I also think that we have to sit down at the table together. We have to look at the rest of the world and see how they're doing things and saying, hey, what we're doing here right now is not good enough. And we can't let these big companies and corporations just throw money to politicians to not help the problem. And then one final thing I'll say is I don't want to be anti-gun. That's not what I'm saying here. But sometimes I think to myself, some people, it's a small portion of the population that are so passionate about firearms, the right to bear arms. I think it's great that you're interested in it. That's awesome. But so passionate that they'll fight this issue like crazy. My question for you is I just think, what if those same people were just as passionate about healthcare, about, I don't know, feeding the hungry, or advancements in technology? I think the world would be a better place in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying that about all people that have guns. I think that there's people that all shapes and sizes, and I understand that it's an equalizer, and I understand that it protects people, and I understand that the element in the room is if you ban the assault weapon, really most shootings are done by handguns. I get all that, and that's why people are afraid to budge. But as someone sitting on the outside looking in, it is something that I find hard to accept looking in, like how to explain it to friends and others, why there's so many guns in America and we don't admit we have a problem. So I think so many people there, we're just blind to that fact. We're just so used to it in the news every day that we don't stop and think that's not normal. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.